Chapter 3. Pagans and Prophets. The beginning of this world began like a fairy tale, a paradise of what dreams are made of. However, its ending is more like a nightmare. If there is any evolution to man, it is not evolving upward, but rather descending downward. This study of man's history is not only interesting and fascinating, but it is very important, for a person with no knowledge of history is like a patient suffering from amnesia. Knowing nothing of his past, he is poorly prepared to cope with the present and the future. The Story of the World, John Southworth, P.X. Both pagans and prophets have played vital roles throughout the history of mankind. By definition, a pagan is a heathen, a non-Christian, a person who has no religion. At times, it is difficult to distinguish a pagan from anybody else. The principles which a person obeys determines what he is. A man may profess to be a Christian but still live by heathen principles. A good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit, neither can a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit. Wherefore by their fruits ye shall know them. Matt. 7:18 and 20. Carrying this concept further, the acts of individuals, good or bad, determine the behavior of a nation. Often nations have professed a religion but in reality lived by pagan practices. A nation's religion, or system of beliefs, can cause peace or war, happiness or misery, prosperity or poverty. From the very beginning of time, man has engaged in various methods of worship. Adam walked in the perfect light of heaven, yet one of his own sons worshipped a different god. Cain instituted his own system of ordinances and delved into false doctrines. Every successive nation has concocted different forms of religion. As early as the 5th chapter of Genesis, it is recorded that man began to do evil constantly. From the Tower of Babel to the time of Noah, men were wicked and served strange gods. The term Babel means to mix or confuse, and mankind have generally been confused ever since. An excellent example of paganism is found in the history of the city of Babylon, now meaning any place of great wealth and wickedness. Babylon the Great. Babylon took its name from Babel and was the capital city of Babylonia in southern Iraq. It became the largest city in the world and was one of the great centers of learning, riches, luxuries, and wickedness. For example, the Bible mentions Belshazzar, who saw handwriting on his wall. Since he couldn't interpret it, he called for the wise men of Babylon. The great city of Babylon was a thriving commercial center, and many nations envied her prosperity and power. It was beautiful, too. The Hanging Gardens became one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The city had many artisans in jewelry and architecture. Their political system was renowned throughout the world, and so was its trade among the nations. Because so many other people and nations wanted to possess Babylon, a huge defense system was required to maintain a constant vigil. The people were religious, with Marduk as a chief god. Many temples were built as evidence of their religious desires. The apostles of Christ, however, never said anything good about Babylon. It has been presumed that one of Peter's letters was written from there. But it was the apostle John who gave the most negative impression, for to him it was a place for the habitation of devils, and the hold of every foul spirit. He said, "For all nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication, and the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth are waxed rich through the abundance of her delicacies." Revelation 18 verse 3. Isaiah foretold of its fall several times. The apostle John linked the end of the world with the fall of Babylon, indicating that they were one and the same. It has been termed the antithesis of the New Jerusalem, as they are complete opposites in every way. From such an early beginning, it is spoken of as one of the great last powers on earth to be destroyed. John the Revelator said Babylon would 1. Sit by many waters. 2. Rule as an international center. 3. Be a great trade and sea power. 4. Persecute the saints. 5. Be weakened by luxury and wealth. 6. Become a great mystery. 7. Have a sudden downfall. There were many reasons for the fall of Babylon, the primary one being because of wickedness. In addition, however, it instituted a tax system which robbed its citizens of nearly 50% of their wealth, similar to our taxing programs today. They also had a code that allowed them to make war against other nations and peoples, even their own, for not worshipping according to their regulations. Their federal policy forced itself into the very lives of its citizens in the most detailed system. Babylon gained the reputation of acting against God's people because of their opposition and persecution. The Apostle John described the city as the mother of harlots, because she spawned her corrupt system and laws into all other nations and people. For this reason, the apostles looked upon the rest of the world in the same light. Under Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon reached a high point in power and prosperity. It became known for its destruction of Jerusalem and the captivity of Judah, bringing the nation of Judah under the control of the god Marduk around 587 BC. By 331 BC, Babylon was captured by Alexander the Great, who never allowed it to rise again. Actually, at Alexander's death, Babylon faded away to its gradual demise. Thus came the fall of one of the greatest empires in history. The civilization of Babylon originated early in world history, as it is recorded in the 10th chapter of Genesis. However, its power and influence among other nations are still felt today. In the last days, according to the testimony of the Apostle John, this powerful influence will captivate all the nations of the world. Certainly it is evident that his prophecy has been fulfilled. There are so many lessons to be learned from the history of Babylon's rise and fall. But do we listen to them? Do we learn from them? Do we try to change the course of people and nations that are following in those footsteps? Let us go on now to a brief history of the paganism that existed among the Egyptians. Egypt, land of mystery. The land of Egypt has been the scene of one of the earliest recorded histories of man, yet it is filled with speculation and mystery. The pyramids stand as a silent testimony to a great people, once very superior in intellect, but eventually crumbling because of moral and intellectual decay. Undoubtedly, they once had a religion that was pure and elevating, but in time, like every religion from God, it suffered from the hands of men. Somewhere in the sands of time, man turned Egypt into a spiritual desert. Throughout their history, they had hundreds of gods. For instance, at one time Isis and her husband Osiris were worshipped. However, Ra, the sun god, was the greatest of all their gods and was considered the supreme being. There were also others, such as Amen-Ra and Number-Ra. Ra was a hawk-headed man, while Osiris was a mummy-type being. Osiris was always at war with Set, the evil being, the warfare representing similarities with daylight and darkness, good and evil. The Egyptians never worshipped images or idols, but living representatives of the gods. Sometimes their deity was typified in character by some animal, such as a crocodile, a cat, or hippopotamus. In one part of Egypt they were sacred, while in another place they were hunted. The hippo was worshipped in Papimes, but detested elsewhere. Gradually there came to be divisions of worship among the Egyptians similar to the divisions among the Christians today. They finally experienced the full turn of the wheel of apostasy. While the early periods of Egypt were glorious, the latter days were but a shadow of the original. Where purity of religion once was their law, soon it descended into many fallacies, superstitions, and ridiculous rituals. Egypt was once a busy, thriving land, filled with active people who thought and lived much the same as we do today. They had their great heroes and statesmen, their businessmen and priests, with high moral standards. But along the trail of success came those corrupt politicians, conniving bankers, crooked lawyers, immoral priests, and money-hungry ministers, with whom we are also familiar. Why does history appear to be like an old-time movie continuously rerunning? There seems to be little need for fiction writers, as true history is more interesting and unbelievable than fiction. Egypt's earliest records are locked in secrecy, much more impenetrable than the pyramids. They were written in characters and markings with several meanings, yet the writers must have known those histories would someday be found and that it would take prophets to interpret them. The writings that have been deciphered have taken us back over 5,000 years, far enough to learn that people had taken upon themselves wild animal characteristics. In 3360 BC, a king by the name of Menes was ruler in Upper Egypt. At that time, the king wanted to unify Upper and Lower Egypt, even if he had to bash in a few heads to do it. In fact, that's just what he did. His expertise as a cranium crusher was so well mastered that he gave himself the name a mighty crusher of skulls. Through much bloodshed and many fractured skulls, Menes was able to unify Egypt again. It became a single nation, but with considerably fewer people. Menes became a pharaoh, and, like so many before him, he worried about death, and rightfully so. In order to prepare for the spirit world, the pharaoh traditionally had to have their bodies preserved. They devised a system of taking out the brains, heart, and entrails, and putting them in a jar. The body was then stuffed like a Thanksgiving turkey, with spices, herbs, and drugs. Both the body and jar were then placed in a tomb with many of the material objects they might need in the next world. These pickled pharaohs thought they would rule as gods in the next world just as they did in this one. Menes was only one of the many Egyptian rulers who upheld this long-established tradition. Since some of them considered themselves a god, they required absolute obedience and subservience from all their subjects. Instead of seeking for the attributes of a god, they wanted only the powers of a god. The sunset of Egypt was well on the way by 3000 BC as they began to merge with other nations. This is always a good way to digress. The nobles of the land took the reins of government, thus introducing the feudal age of Egypt. The pharaoh often became a figurehead with very little power. Thus, most of the pharaohs aren't worth mentioning. By about 1800 BC, Egypt was invaded and conquered by the Hyksos from southwestern Asia, who ruled over the unhappy Egyptians for about 200 years. The Hyksos brought with them the horse and chariot, something new to Egypt at that time. The tide was turned on the Hyksos, however, when Thutmose I became pharaoh, and he conquered their lands as far as the Euphrates. His son, Thutmose II, never accomplished much, and at his death, he was replaced by his strong-minded sister, Hatshepsut. Here was the first she-pharaoh, and what a woman! She knew what she wanted and took any means to get it. She knew that most of the men were womanly, and the women were something else, so she had to keep her identity hidden. She put on a false beard when appearing in public, making the people think that perhaps it was still her brother ruling Egypt. But that was not all, she would mount up with all her armor and lead the armies into battle. During her reign, many notable buildings were planned and constructed. The great temple of Karnak, near Thebes, was built. These lofty obelisks, which are so well noted today, are called Cleopatra's Needles, but they were actually erected 1,500 years before Cleopatra's reign in Egypt. Hatshepsut's husband, who was many years younger than she, was Thutmose III, son of her brother Thutmose II. As long as Hatshepsut ruled, poor little Thutmose III was kept out of sight and out of power, hating his dominant wife. When she died, he became ruler of Egypt. His first act as pharaoh was to have her name removed from every building and every monument in Egypt, wherever it appeared. The Story of the World, John Southworth, page 20. He made a better military leader than he did a husband, and soon enlarged the empire. But one of his projects was to replace the old religion of Egypt with a new one. They would worship the god Aten. In order to get away from all the priests, temples, and ceremonies of the old religion, he moved the capital of Egypt from Thebes to Akhenaton. This religious reformation occupied all his time, and he thus neglected the functions of the empire. He changed his name to Akhenaton, spirit of Aten. There are many carvings left of him and his new wife, Nefertiti, some showing them in a family setting. By about 722 BC, the throne of the pharaohs was overtaken by the Nubians from the south, who conquered the country, and according to John Southworth, previously quoted, the throne of the pharaohs was then first occupied by Negroes. According to facsimile number 3, Pearl of Great Price, p. 42, blacks had been used as slaves, and the pharaoh is shown to be white. A variety of Egyptian rituals and ceremonies have been practiced through the centuries, as religion of some kind has been the center of their existence. The original power and doctrines and gods were changed, however, and became similar to those of the pagans. One early scholar reported in 1884. Herodotus, the Greek historian, who visited Egypt about 450 BC, was struck with the extreme attention which the Egyptians paid to religion. He says that they were the most religious of all mankind. The passing stranger was impressed with the pompous ceremonies, the magnificent festivals, the imposing processions, and the many gorgeously robed priests. He found large temples, where the walls were covered with sculptures, paintings, and hieroglyphic writings. All Egypt was stamped with the impress of religion. Every art and science, and all literature were distinctly connected with religion, and were used in the service of their deities. They surpassed all nations in the reverence they paid to the gods. Their religion was by no means an open one. Error's chains, how forged and broken, Frank S. Dobbins, page 93. Egypt's apostasy came about the same way as it did in Babylon, through the influence of corrupt and wicked men, who gradually overturned good religion and good government, leaving their nation in shambles. By heeding the call of God's prophets, they could have avoided such disaster. Egypt's history has continued for nearly 5,000 years, about 25 times longer than the history of the United States. The influence of their gods and their religions, both good and evil, has endured through the years and will last until the end of the world. So, after very briefly considering the history and paganism of Babylon and Egypt, we can better understand the need for God to send a prophet to gather and remove the righteous from such wicked surroundings. Moses, a prophet of God. From the multitude of nations that have been born, developed, and died, relatively few honorable and noteworthy leaders have emerged. Of all the political, military, and religious leaders, only occasionally have we had any truly outstanding men whose life and teachings have made a positive and lasting contribution to the world. One of these few was Moses. His critics come and go. But Moses still stands out as the foremost man of the pre-Christian world. He took a race of slaves and, under inconceivably trying circumstances, molded them into a powerful nation which has altered the whole course of history. Bible Handbook by Haley, page 120. Outside of the Bible, there is little evidence that Moses ever lived. But then the Egyptians were famous for wiping out all history of their enemies or predecessors. Often each new pharaoh destroyed every stone inscription bearing the name of the pharaoh before him. Some stone columns were erased so many times it's a wonder they still stand. And certainly, Moses was no hero to the Egyptians. The story of Moses describes him as being born to a Jewish father and raised by an Egyptian mother, which would not have been considered an honor by the Egyptians or the Hebrews. However, the facts are that he was born of Hebrew parents and his step-parents were Egyptians. It was, therefore, in the learning and teachings of the Egyptians that Moses received his education. He was well on his way to becoming Pharaoh when his life was turned around. Luke, one of the apostles of Christ, gives us a little information on the upbringing of Moses. In which time Moses was born, and was exceeding fair, and nourished up in his father's house 3 months, and when he was cast out, Pharaoh's daughter took him up, and nourished him for her own son. And Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and was mighty in words and in deeds. And when he was full 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren the children of Israel. And seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended him, and avenged him that was oppressed, and smote the Egyptian. Acts 7 verses 20-24. The Egyptian taskmaster died. The next verse indicates that Moses had already begun his mission to deliver the Israelites from their bondage, but they didn't understand who he was or what he was doing any more than the Egyptians did. To continue. For he supposed his brethren would have understood how that God by his hand would deliver them, but they understood not. The next day when Moses returned to visit them, he was greeted with, "Who made thee a ruler and a judge over us? Wilt thou kill me, as thou didst the Egyptian yesterday?" Then fled Moses at this saying and was a stranger in the land of Midian. Acts 7:25, 27-29. Moses realized that the Israelites didn't want to be freed, they were fearing for their lives. When he had grown to manhood, Moses commanded an army for Egypt and won notable battles. Later when he wanted to lead the Israelites, they weren't ready for him. He waited 40 years for them to get ready. When he was 80 years old, the call came again to lead the people, but this time it appears that Moses felt that he himself was not ready. He made excuses and seemed to lack the confidence that he had before. But Moses was instructed by the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to go back and deliver the Israelites with power. And to make sure he understood it, God repeated it 3 times. To introduce Moses to the Hebrews and show forth the power of God that was with Moses, he performed great miracles. These miracles were not to convince Pharaoh, but rather the children of Israel of the existence and power of God. This was to give them faith that God was capable and willing of protecting and guiding them. After playing magic tricks with snakes for the edification of the Pharaoh, Moses and the magicians left the court knowing that Moses had the strongest medicine. But it was still too early to convince the Israelites, or Pharaoh, of this fact. To properly instruct the Israelites that the God of the Egyptians was not the true God, it was necessary to show them that the gods of Egypt were powerless. One of the miracles was turning the Nile into blood. The Nile was one of the gods of Egypt. The multiplication of the frogs was another blasphemy. Frogs were sacred. They were so numerous that they were dying by the tons. The miracle of darkness was a blow to Ra, their sun god. The great grand slam plague of death to all the firstborn was the straw that broke the camel's back. The firstborn children were the choice of the Egyptian gods. Death to the firstborn of their cows was death to their sacred gods. What a proof of the failure and lack of power of their gods. The miracle of the Red Sea was further proof of power. The mighty Egyptian army was destroyed, and not one soul of the Israelites was lost in the battle. Battle? Not really, for they were on the run. The temples, palaces, and monuments in Egypt are among the grandest in the world, and many of them were made by the Israelites. The city of Thebes, about 4 square miles, was once a display of brilliant colors and structures plated with gold. It, too, reached its zenith while the Israelites were there. While many of those astounding edifices still remain, the Israelites are gone. But the man who gave them a name, a nation, and reason for being was Moses. He helped them to be a better, more powerful, and respected nation than even the great country of Egypt. It took 10 plagues of national proportion to get the message across and the Hebrews out of bondage. But even then they didn't like it. In spite of the miracles, they regretted not being back in the security of slavery. But under Moses' direction, this little band of nomads grew from an insignificant nation in the wilderness to become the mightiest nation on earth. It was on Mount Sinai that Moses received the law, a set of rules that could make the Israelites a nation of kings and priests to the true God of heaven. Only 4 of these were directed to God, 6 were for themselves. Every nation that tried to overtake these Israelite communities were defeated. The males of their enemies were killed, the women and children were brought into the Israelite camps and added to their families. This greatly increased their numbers up to the reign of King David, at which time they were feared by every other nation on the earth. Out of Egypt has come a most impressive message. The Egyptians gradually abandoned their original and probably inspired prophets in order to follow their own man-made theories. Therefore, God established through power and miracles a new nation under his laws, making the people even greater than the Egyptians. The most prominent feature of the mission of Moses was his revelation of the laws and the identity of the true God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That testimony and record is clear enough, says Isaiah, that men, though fools, should not err therein. But they did, and still do. As in the nature of nearly all men, the Israelites sought to make God the way they wanted him to be, not the way he was. And it's a sad commentary that because of the influence from those around them, they, too, became one with the world.